Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
How is everybody?
Good.
Yeah. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes,
I can hear
you're
you.
great.
Okay, good. Rust, how you doing, man?
Never been better.
Oh, good.
I haven't had so much fun since the pigs ate my little brother.
And that was a long time ago. All right. Let's see, what time is it? Let me put my thing. Shall we get started? Does anybody have any pressing questions or anything you want to ask about the 35 or 35R before we start? Okay, so are we ready?
Absolutely.
Okay, let's go.
Calling out of town, I'm doing a safari here in Africa. How would you?
Can everybody see me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, good. Okay, so let's start with we're going to do 35 and the 35R today. So there's the 35, both of these forms actually can be, if you're not careful, these can be the two most expensive forms in a contract. A lot of things to pay attention to when you're doing the 35 and explaining and talking to our clients about them. But let's start going down the 35 and start with the first section. Okay, so one of the things to pay attention here is the agreement is conditioned on the buyer's subjective satisfaction of the inspection. So, and that's going to be important, and I'll go over that again when we get to the 35R. It's going to be important when it comes to asking the buyer or the seller to do repairs from an inspection, on the inspection response from an inspection. Okay, so buyer's inspection may include buyer's option and without limitation, the structural, mechanical, general condition of the improvements to the property, the compliance, the building codes, all that stuff. And the inspection has to be performed by either a buyer or a licensed inspector. A lot of people think the contractors can do an inspection, but they really can't. There are exceptions, and the exceptions are, there are exceptions for.
Can I get the 2 12-ounce double mochas, but like tiny?
Double mochas. So there are exceptions for specific trades, but only if they're going to do the inspection within the context of their trades. So the exceptions are engineers, architects, electricians, plumbers, pesticide people, structural pest inspectors. They can inspect the property, but only they can't do a whole home inspection, just just relative to their trade, engineer or architect. So that's not, you can't use them as a whole inspector. You would use those if you're going to do like you need extra time to do, if the inspector calls for, hey, the electrician should look at the electrical panel or something, and they can come in and look at it that way, or look at it then. But anyway, so that's the gist of it. The subjective part about it is going to get interesting. Again, I'll talk about that on the 35R. The next paragraph here in the inspection, section 1, is the sewer inspections, and most agents probably know now about Orangeburg pipe in Washington. Orangeburg pipe is basically compressed cardboard, petroleum wood product, a pulpwood pipe, and it's way past its life expectancy, and so we're having a lot of problems with that. It deteriorates, collapses, and stuff. So that's why they put this sewer inspection section in the 17 or 35, yeah, in the inspection contingency. I don't believe it's ever a bad idea to have the sewer scope. They're pretty cheap now to have somebody come out and do a video. So I think those are good. Okay, buyer's obligations. All inspections are to be ordered by the buyer, performed by inspectors of buyer's choice, completed at buyer's expense. Buyer shall not alter the property, or this is a big thing. Don't do anything to the property when your inspector's inspecting it. And that's why a lot of inspectors won't turn on the gas in a gas fireplace if it's turned off. They don't do anything. They just do how it's existing at that particular time. And so they may ask, if the gas isn't turned on in the fireplace, they may ask. They note in the inspection report, hey, have it looked at by a HVAC person, a professional. So don't do anything. Make any modifications to the house at all during the inspection. Okay, so here we come to time frames and stuff. The buyer's notice: the inspection contingency shall conclusively be deemed waived unless the default is 10 days. Now, and Ken is always talking about this too. When you're going over all of the forms, but the inspection form with your buyers, actually write in if you want to leave it at 10 days, write in 10 days and explain what that is to the buyer at that time. We have a lot of times have a habit of forgetting our time frames, and that's really it really can cause a lot of problems. So we need to be careful about that. So 10 days, buyer gives notice of 10 days, unless within 10 days, not filled in after mutual acceptance of the agreement. Buyer gives notice, approving the inspection, disapproving the inspection, and terminating the agreement, which is why the inspection contingency is called kind of a get out of jail free card. You actually don't even have to do an inspection to terminate the transaction using the inspection contingency. Or that the buyer will conduct additional inspections, which if the inspector is asking for a specialist to look at the plumbing or the electrical or the roof. And then the last part is proposing repairs to the property. These are the buyer's requests. Proposing repairs to the property or modifications to the agreement. You could be, if you don't ask for repairs, sometimes people will just, or agents or buyers will ask to lower the price or pay more towards their closing costs. Somehow changing the terms of the contract. Okay, so this next section is important. If the buyer fails to give timely notice, then this inspection contingency shall be deemed waived, and seller shall not be obligated to make any repairs. That's a big deal. Waive, seller shall not be obligated to make any repairs or modifications. Buyer shall not provide, and this is really a big deal. Buyer shall not provide the inspection report or portions of the report to the seller unless seller requests otherwise, or as required in paragraph 1B of the 30 of paragraph 1B. It talks about additional inspections. If you ask for additional inspections on the 35R, you have to have the recommendation from the home inspector to make that a valid request for additional time. So at this point, there's no penalty if the buyer sends over or the buyer's agent sends over the inspection report. What happens is they're actually default of the contract. They're breaching the contract because they're not supposed to do that. But there's no recourse. There's no penalty if the contract goes to close. You know, everything's fine. If the contract doesn't close because for some reason, then the buyer and seller both might have to go just end up talking to a lawyer and say, hey, the buyer harmed me by sending me this report. The buyer's like, you know, I want my earnest money back because I couldn't close, and then the seller's going to say, hey, well, but you breached the contract, so you don't get your earnest money back. There's nothing in the contract that says what happens, you know, at that point. So that's where a lawyer's gonna have to come into play. But Ken has written to the state, and what they're gonna do, they're working on some kind of a penalty for that. What they're looking at is if the buyer agent sends over the inspection report without the seller's permission or without the seller asking for it, the 35, the inspection contingency is going to be waived. So that would be an issue. Okay, so anyway, yeah, don't send over the report unless they ask for it. And then only, what I try to tell people is just copy and paste just the part from the report that the buyer asks or the seller asks for, and again, not unless the seller asks for it. Okay, so the next part, buyer's request for seller's repairs and modifications, and then part of that is the buyer's request, a response, and the buyer's reply. So on the 35R, we have how it works is you have the buyer's request for modifications or additional time, and then you have, well, for additional time, the seller doesn't request, but if the buyer requests repairs or modifications, then you have the seller's response to that request, and then the last part of that 35R of this inspection is the buyer's reply. So you have the request, the response, and the reply on this. So if the buyer sends a request, the 35R to a seller, the seller has 3 days to respond to that request. Some agents will say, hey, no, I decided I don't want this house, and then they'll send a 35R over, terminating the contract. Well, you can't do that. Once you've sent the 35R, you're bound by the terms of the agreement of this addendum. So you have to wait. You have to give the seller the 3 days to respond. So the buyer sends a request, which brings up. I'll talk about how to, about making requests in the 35-hour. So the buyer sends a request, the seller has 3 days to respond. So if I get a request, if I send a request today to a seller, the third day is going to be Wednesday, right? You don't, on 5 days or less, you don't count weekends or holidays. So it'd be Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. So the seller responds by Wednesday, or if the seller doesn't respond by Wednesday, 9 o'clock Wednesday, then that will be, you can look at that as the seller's response. Okay, so now that which in any case, if they respond or don't respond, that triggers the third day, or the third section of this, which is the buyer's reply. So we had the buyer's request, the seller's response. Now we have the buyer's reply. So the buyer can accept the seller's response, or reject the seller's response and terminate the transaction, or they can ask for additional, they can disapprove of the response, the buyer's response and seller's response, and ask for additional changes. If the seller doesn't respond, they can ask for, they can resubmit the same request if they want, or they can change it to try and make it more palatable to the buyer or to the seller. The important thing about this time frame is it doesn't extend. So if next Wednesday starts well, actually Thursday would be day one of the or the buyer's reply period, the last period of this 35R, then the buyer and seller have until Monday, or Thursday, Friday, Monday at 9 o'clock to come to an agreement. You can negotiate, you can go back and forth as many times as you want during that period. But the point is, if each time that you present another alternative, that's a counter, and everything before that goes away. So if the last counter that you sent over, if the seller doesn't respond to that, then you either have to move forward or terminate, because at 9 o'clock on day 3 of the buyer's reply period, if there's no agreement, the contingency is satisfied and everybody moves forward. So the third part is actually a little bit of a dangerous part for the buyers, because they may end up getting less than they want in the inspection. So, and again, the time frame they don't repeat after on the third the buyer's reply period, the third period. That's it. Although, having said that, just like anything in the contract, or just about anything, if you can get both parties to sign an addendum extending that time period, that can be done. Okay, we'll talk about that more in the 35R if there's any more to talk about. Okay, let's see, what do we have here? If the seller agrees to make repairs proposed by a buyer, then the repairs shall be accomplished at the seller's expense in a commercially reasonable manner and in accordance with all applicable laws, no fewer than 3 days prior to closing date. Now, we have within 5 days, we can do a final walkthrough. So when you're doing a final walkthrough, make sure that these repairs are done, because they have two additional days past the 5 days that they have to be done by prior to closing. In the case of hazardous materials, repair means removal or treatment, including but not limited to removal, or at seller's option, decommissioning of any oil storage tank. Now, this is something that we don't think about very often. It's come up a couple of times in the last month, where somebody has found that there's a lot of the oil tanks for these old oil furnaces are in the basement, but a lot of them are buried on site somewhere in the yard, and that's a big deal for, you know, if it comes up and you have to decommission those, it's not cheap, because you have to do a study to see if any of it was leaking or anything like that, and if it does find that it was leaking, it's got to be the soil around it has to be remediated and all that. So that can get expensive. So you need to be careful about that. The state does have some kind of an insurance thing that pays up to, I think, $50,000 to help dispose of storage tanks, oil storage tanks. So you can look into that. So anyway, but it's something to be conscious of at some point. And the next section, oil storage tanks here. Any inspection regarding oil storage tanks or contamination from such tanks shall be limited solely to determining the presence or non-presence of oil storage tanks on the property, unless otherwise agreed in writing by buyer and seller. So if there is an underground storage tank, they determine there is one, then you have to this would be an additional inspection. You'd have to get another, get permission to do further look into it, see if there's any contamination or not. On-site sewage disposal systems advisory. Buyers advise that on-site sewage disposal systems, including septic systems, are subject to strict government regulation. If it is on a septic system, then we have the 22S, which is the septic addendum contingency. So you have to be sure, and you would be sure and use that anyway. But buyers advised to consider conducting an inspection of any on-site sewage system in addition to the inspection of the property provided by the 35R, or provided by the 35. So yeah, that you'd use the 22S for that. Neighborhood review contingency, section 2 here. So people have had buyers go spend the night, park their car and spend the night in a neighborhood to see if there's any activity at night, or it could be, you could go look and see if the neighborhood's too noisy or the road's too noisy, or it could be anything subjective. This is very subjective, but it is a valid contingency, and there's a Form 90 addressing this if somebody disapproves of the neighborhood. So don't dismiss the neighborhood, but just check the box and move on. It can be a valid inspection, part of the inspection. Pre-inspection, let's see, pre-inspection. So in Seattle, a lot of it's very common that sellers list agents have the buyer do a home inspection before they even write an offer, before they submit an offer. Don't see it too much here. I've seen it more recently in the last few months, but people do it. And then when they write the offer, then there's no inspection contingency. It's done. If there's anything big, they can ask for that on optional clauses or on a separate addendum if there's something that they want repaired. But there is no. Usually they won't have the financing contingency. Again, we don't see that much here, but it's starting to show up a little bit. And then a waiver of inspection. Obviously, if you're buyer, you see that a lot. See this a lot with investors who are going to go in and redo the whole house anyway. They waive the inspection. It's obvious. The obvious attraction for a seller is, they don't have to worry about somebody going in and finding something and getting, negotiating a price or asking the seller to do something. But it's always important to talk to your buyers about the importance of doing a home inspection, and then make sure they check that box if they're not going to do one. Okay. Anybody have any questions about the inspection contingency? I mean, it's pretty straightforward, except the biggest hangup is usually in time frames for this addendum. You just got to be careful of what you put down for the inspection, and keep track of the time frames after the contract is signed around. Okay. I think that's pretty much. No questions? Okay, let's move over to, I've got these up on my screen here. I'm moving the thing around a little bit. Okay, 35R. The first section, pretty self-explanatory. The buyer's inspection of the property is approved and the inspection contingency is satisfied. Sellers love that, love getting that 35R. And a lot of times, well, actually not a lot. You don't see that a lot, but sometimes buyers will get that satisfied right away. Just do a quick walk of it. It's almost like they buy it sight unseen sometimes, and they have an inspection contingency. They'll use the inspection. They'll use this inspection contingency as a first walkthrough, and then they weren't going to do an inspection anyway, but they use it for the first walkthrough, and then they just check the first box and move on. And this is the second box is the why this is called get out of jail free card, kind of. Buyer's inspection of the property is disapproved and the agreement is terminated. The earnest money shall be refunded to buyer. Keep in mind when you're talking to buyers about this, it says, and Ken talks about this on everything. Earnest money shall be refunded to buyers. The buyer's entitled to the earnest money, but if the seller is contrary and doesn't want to sign a Form 50, then disbursement of earnest money, then that could be an issue. But so when you're doing, if you terminate, all you have to do is check this box, and this terminates the transaction. This is a notice. The seller doesn't have to sign the 35R if you terminate the transaction using the 35R. It's a notice. You send it to the list agent and the list office, everybody in a transaction, and the contract is terminated. So you send the 35R and a Form 50, not a 51, a Form 50, to terminate the transaction. Okay, so the buyer, the next sentence, paragraph, the buyer gives notice of additional inspections. This is, if the inspector sees something issue, maybe double taps or something on a breaker panel, or something doesn't look right to him, he'll recommend that the buyer have an electrician, look at the panel. And if you're asking for additional inspections, you would ask for additional inspections, and you would include that recommendation. This is the one time that you include something from the inspection without the seller's permission. But this is another thing where I just tell agents to copy and paste the specific wording. Buyer inspector recommends that buyer have this looked at by an electrician or a plumber, or whoever it might be. Now, be careful, because if you don't send the the inspector's recommendation is attached. The time for buyer's response to the initial and additional inspection is extended as provided in paragraph 1B of Form 35. This actually extends the inspection period. So you're extending the period, but and it says specifically the inspector's recommendation is attached. Again, this is the only time that you submit anything having to do with the inspection without the seller's permission. But it must be attached, otherwise the request for additional, the notice of additional inspection is not valid. And say if on day 10 you give notice of additional inspections and you don't attach the recommendations from the inspector, on day 11 the contingency is satisfied, because you didn't give proper notification of extension. So the inspection time frame ran out at 9 o'clock on day 10, and so now the contingency is waived or satisfied. So I need to be careful about that. Okay, the next part is the buyer requests following modifications and or repairs. If seller agrees to these modifications or repairs, then special contingency shall be deemed satisfied. Okay, so some of the requests can be fairly straightforward. Buyer requests that seller have a licensed HVAC person, a requisite professional HVAC person, service, clean, service the furnace, and assure it's in proper working condition. That's fairly straightforward. Some of the things that have to be done if there needs a contractor, the best thing to do would be, and be very specific. Words matter, right? And the fewer words, the better. But the words that you put down, make sure they're saying exactly what you want. The buyer to have, let me be an example. Something like a roof, something on the roof is shingles are missing, or something on the eave of the roof is not coming. Let's see, that's not a good example, but what I'm trying to say is that if you have a contractor, buyer, seller, you just ask the contractor to say, buyer requests that a licensed bonded contractor repair the roof, or repair a rail, or repair the deck, without being specific. So the seller is going to have a contractor go out there and say, hey, what's wrong with this deck? It could be that they go out and see that there's a broken board, or a rail is loose or something, and then they fix that, and then okay, the seller at that point thinks they're satisfied. They've satisfied the buyer's request. The buyer goes and looks at it on a final walkthrough and say, hey, you didn't fix the deck, and go, yeah, we did fix the deck. So that's where the subjective part comes in, without specifically asking what to fix. Nail, let's see, can't think of an example now, but the best case scenario would be to have, because a seller is going to go out and get their own contractor to do it, and the buyer may not like what their contractor did. So to eliminate, for the seller, to eliminate the any misconception or what's the word I'm looking for? To make sure that the work gets done according to buyer satisfaction. What the buyer should do is, if there's any big work to be done, have a contractor give them an invoice, a bid for the work. And then when the buyer asks for the request, the buyer says, request that the following work be done per contractor's bid and invoice, and then and by buyer's contractor. So the specific work to be done is on the bid from the contractor, and then the buyer, if the seller approves, then the buyer has nothing to fall back on. If the work isn't done to their liking, then they can't come back on the buyer. It's on the seller's contract or the buyer's contractor who did the work. So that's the best way to do that, would be to have the buyer say, this is the work that needs to be done, that we're requesting be done, and here's the bid to do it, and here's the contractor to do it. So that minimizes any confusion or subjectivity when it comes to the final walkthrough, or when they go back and look at the work that was done. Other parts of the, other less work that not as extensive a work that needs to be done can be put, the request can be put in these lines and stuff. But again, just make sure you're very specific about, what work is to be done by who, and in the time frame that you want it done in, and try to get it done within 5 days of closing, because then you can do the final walkthrough. The default is 3 days. It has to be working 3 days, but this was what the request is on the 35R. You can request it be done within 5 days. Also, you can use the 35R to modify the purchase and sale agreement. You can ask them to lower the price, or pay some or more of their closing costs. So you can do just about, use the 35R for a lot of things besides having repairs done. It's a good tool to modify, one of the only ones to modify the terms of the agreement. But anybody have any questions about this part of the 35R? Again, the biggest thing is to be clear about what the buyer is requesting. Get a time frame, who's going to do it, and what needs to be done. And don't ever forget, if you're going to ask for additional time, to attach the recommendation from the inspector. So the time frames on these 35R, they can last forever. So say if you have a, and this can drag on and it can get annoying for the seller, but say you have, it's like President's Day, you have a 35, President's Day weekend. Let's go back to that. Day 10 was, President's Day, okay, President's Day weekend. And so on day 10, President's Day weekend would have been a Monday. So actually day 10 would have been on that Friday, but now you have it 3 more days. So now you're at 13 days. On President's Day, you asked for additional 5 days. So now you're at 13 days. Now you've got Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. That's 17 days. Now you've got Friday and Sunday, or Saturday and Sunday. That's 19 days. So day 5 now you have is 20 days. You're almost at 3 weeks on a 10-day inspection period. So try not to drag it out as much as you can, because that can get annoying. And that's not even the end of it, because you still have the 3-day seller response period. And then, so if the seller responds, which would, even if you get send us the response, the buyer's request on that Monday, on day 20, now you have day 1 is for the seller's response is Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And then then Friday would be day 1 of the final reply period. Now you're into another weekend and stuff, so it can drag on for forever. But anyway, so be careful about the time frames because it can drag on too long. And all it does is annoy people. On the other hand, if your buyers needed time, you can drag it out for a long time. Okay, and we've gone over these time frames in section 2. So we've gone over the buyer's request. Now we're at the seller's response. Seller agrees to all modification or repairs. Check that box and you move on. Seller always offers to correct only the following. Could be 1 or 2 of the sections above, or if there were too many things, then there's a separate addendum showing the request. They can take it from there. Sellers offers to correct only the following conditions. Put in whatever they want. Seller rejects all the proposals by buyer, at which point now the buyer has to decide, well, do I want to present another one? Keep trying to negotiate some stuff, which, at this point, the buyer has nothing to lose to keep negotiating for the final 3 days to try and get something, because they've already agreed to nothing. Or the last part about it, seller rejects all proposals by buyer, proposes the following alternative modifications, repairs. And that's pretty self-explanatory. They could reject everything from above and then just put one of the items back in, or they could say they're not going to do any of it, but they'll lower the price, $1,000 or something. So they could put just about anything in there. So that's the end of this period. It's either day 1 of this period, or day 2, or day 3. Once the seller responds or doesn't respond, that triggers the 3rd period, buyer's reply. So the buyer accepts seller's response and agrees to proceed to closing as provided by the agreement, in the agreement. Okay, that's best case scenario. Next box, buyer rejects seller's response Buyer disapproves of the inspection and this agreement is terminated, earnest money shall be refunded to buyer. Okay. Yep, pretty much the same as box 2 on section 1. You're only this time you did the inspection, but you're still terminating the transaction. But earnest money, the buyer is entitled to earnest money. It shall be refunded to buyer, but so this, and the third box here in this third section is buyer rejects seller's response but offers the attached alternative proposals for modification or repair. Now, buyer acknowledges that the inspection contingency will be waived unless buyer and seller reach written agreement or buyer gives notice disapproving the inspection and terminating the agreement before deadline in paragraph 1C, which is this is the last 3-day period in the inspection contingency. So the third part here where you can keep negotiating, and like if on section 2, if the seller rejected, I'm being redundant here, but if the seller rejected all proposals by buyer, the buyer has nothing to lose by trying to negotiate something out of the inspection in this third section. If the seller responds in section 2 with only repairing some things, if the buyer disapproves of that and wants them to fix other stuff, they need to be careful because the seller doesn't have to respond to that. But whatever the seller responded to in section 2 is now taken off the table. So if the seller doesn't respond to anything or respond to the buyer's request in section 3 at all during that 3-day period, then the seller doesn't have to do anything. And the buyer either terminates or the contingency is waived. And then again, the buyer doesn't do anything. So that's the tricky part. That's the trickiest part of this thing for the buyer. If they try to keep getting more and more, they need to be careful on how much they are willing to give up. So in section 1, if the buyer gives notice of additional inspection, the buyer's recommendation, and then, so again, that essentially, they're asking for additional inspections. That essentially extends the time frame of the inspection contingency, 35. So now, this is one of the times, one of the only times, there are two. One of the only times where you would bring in another 35R. So you've extended the time period for the inspection in section 1 by asking for additional inspections. Now you get a new 35R and you're requesting you're making a request based on the extended time frame of the inspection. So that would be the only time that one of the only times that you would bring in another 35R, a new 35R. You can't do it to terminate, like we were saying when I was going over it in 35, but you would use a new 35R if you're going to make requests after additional inspections. Another time you would use a clean 35R is in section 3, the buyer's reply. If you've checked the box where you're going to make modifications to the seller's response and you're trying to negotiate that, if you can't come to an agreement by the time frame, by the end of the time frame, the 3-day time frame, and you want to terminate the transaction, then you would get a new 35R and you would check the box, buyer rejects seller's response, buyer disapproves of the inspection, and this agreement is terminated. Now that would include all the seller's responses from the previous 35R. So those are two times where you would bring in a new 35R. And then in section 3, if you terminated it, again, that's a notice. You terminate it, it's done. And then you present that with the transaction is terminated. You present that with a Form 50 requesting the earnest money for the buyer. And then you're done with that. Any questions about any of that? One of the things if anybody's looking, if any buyers are looking now for properties, online, obviously, and somebody wants to make an offer, the new form that came out last week, the 22FM, addresses the contingencies. So it modifies the contingency dates. It defaults to 10 days. So any contingencies or conditions in the agreement are extended at 10 days, unless you fill in a different amount. So that extends the inspection contingency too. And that is, if people worried about, well, what about an inspection? Well, if you get this 22FM signed, then all parties are bound by that time frame. It extends it again, unless you put in a different time frame. It extends it 10 days past the original time frame in a contingency. I guess that's about it. I know Ken has gone over the 35R a lot and stuff, but it never hurts. I'm glad you guys came through. It never hurts to go over it again. Just to refresh everybody's thing about it. So anybody have any questions about it?
I got a question, Steve. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Okay. And it goes back all the way back to the beginning of the Form 35.
Yeah.
Paragraph 1A, line 10. It says that property performed by buyer, inspection of the property performed by buyer or a person licensed. What qualifies the buyer to be an inspector, and what are the limitations of his inspection?
The buyer isn't qualified as an inspector, but the contract allows the addendum allows the buyer to inspect the property.
So if the buyer inspects the property and sees things that he doesn't like, that need repair, then he makes a recommendation to be repaired.
It has to come from a licensed inspector.
Okay, all right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point.
There's some other questions in the chat box too, Steve. I don't know if you can see your chat box.
Oh, I don't know. I don't see the chat box. Let's see. I'm sorry, I don't see a chat box. Maybe somebody gonna unmute and ask.
Exit full screen, and then just.
I got it. Here we go.
And it'll put up.
In reference to how many times will a buyer have a right to enter for inspections? Example, inspection was done, and actually they have the inspection. They can they can go in. Actually, they only can go in once unless they're doing the. They can't go in an unlimited number of times. They can go in, and they can bring in plumbers and contractors and stuff. They can only go in once unless they're doing additional inspections. Is there a form on the seller for the seller to request portions of the report if needed for repair classifications. No, there isn't. That would be documented by an email or text from the list agent. If someone can see the chat room and has a microphone, can you please speak? No, there are 4 questions. Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, I'm new to this, so let's see here. What qualifies a buyer? Yeah, no, nothing. What about septic and well inspections regarding who pays? Okay, so if you're doing a land and acreage, a house out on land and acreage, I would use the land and acreage addendum. The land and acreage addendum, you can ask the buyer can ask the seller to do the well quality and quantity test and to pump and certify check out the septic system. The well addendum, it says that the buyer is going to do the well test and pay for it out of their thing. And the septic asks the buyer or the seller to give them any paperwork, or if it hasn't been pumped in the last 6 months, then to do the septic test. Now, don't ever use the land and acreage addendum, or the 22S and the 22R, which are the septic and well addendums, with the 22LA, which is land and acreage addendum. If you ask the buyer or the seller, if buyer asks the seller to do the well quality and quantity test and the septic tests, and the seller agrees to it on the land and acreage addendum, terrific. But if you also include 22S and a 22, the 22S is fine because that the seller pays for the septic test. But the 22S and the 22R supersede any other addendum in the contract. So the buyer, if you include a 22R in addition to 22A, the buyer will end up having to pay for the well test. So be careful about that. Don't ever use this well and septic in the same addendum, or I mean the same contract. Okay, let's see, what qualifies a buyer in reference to how many times? It's on seller to request portion. No, someone can see the chat room. Okay. Okay, I think that's all the questions there. Did that answer those questions?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, if there are any other questions, I think I've done as much damage as I can do. I guess everybody is anybody talking to any buyers right now, or looking at houses online with buyers? Doesn't look like it.
I've spoken with some people from out of state, but that was before the order went into effect to shut everything down.
Yeah, there's a round table this afternoon, and I think it'd probably be a good idea for everybody to look on it, or to sit in on it and listen in on it and see what's going on around the MLS. The Washington Realtor sent out a notice this morning with frequently asked questions. There was a lot of good information there. So just have to we're getting better and better at working digital, I guess. So moving from social distancing to digital proximity. So, all right, well, if there are any other questions, I guess that's it. I'll talk to everybody later. Take care. Have a great day.
You.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.